July 1940 pressed down on Berlin with heavy summer heat, the kind that made the stone walls of the Reich Chancellery feel close and airless. Maps of Europe stretched across long tables inside the operations rooms, red pins marking victories that had come so quickly even the clerks struggled to keep the dates straight. One by one the reports arrived, carried by officers whose boots echoed down marble corridors polished to a mirror shine. Poland had collapsed in weeks the previous autumn. Denmark had fallen almost before its government could gather in an emergency session. Norway had fought longer, but it too had slipped from the Allied grasp. The Netherlands had lasted 5 days. Belgium a little longer. France, the giant that had once held the Western Front for 4 terrible years in the last war, had broken in 6 weeks. By the summer of 1940, the continent of Europe lay under German control like a conquered chessboard. In a narrow office adjoining the main operations hall sat Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, a young intelligence officer whose task was simple. Read, translate, summarize. Every day brought the same rhythm. Signals from occupied France. Reconnaissance photographs from the Channel coast. British radio broadcasts captured by monitoring stations and rushed through translation desks. The war, everyone said, was nearly finished. Even the older officers, the veterans who had survived the mud and horror of the First World War, spoke with cautious relief now. Germany had done in a year what it had failed to do in 4 during the last conflict. Karl did not celebrate the victories. His work left him staring too long at the details behind the triumphs. Equipment counts, fuel inventories, weather reports. But even he could not deny the overwhelming reality of the situation. Britain stood alone now, no allies on the continent. Its army had escaped from the beaches of northern France during the evacuation at Dunkirk evacuation. But the men who crossed the Channel had left behind almost everything that made an army dangerous. Tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition. What returned to England were soldiers, yes, but soldiers stripped of their teeth. The numbers were simple, and numbers rarely lied. Germany possessed more divisions, more tanks, more aircraft. Along the French coast, only a narrow stretch of water separated the victorious armies of the Reich from the island that remained outside their control. 21 miles of Channel water, that was all that stood between the Wehrmacht and Britain. One afternoon a sealed folder arrived on Karl's desk, its cover stamped with the insignia of the Armed Forces High Command. Inside were intercepted transcripts of British broadcasts. Karl adjusted his spectacles and began translating the English words into German, carefully choosing phrases that preserved the tone of the original speaker. The voice on the recording was unmistakable, the gravelly cadence already familiar to anyone who monitored the BBC. The speaker was Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister. Karl listened to the speech twice before writing a single word. The translation did not make sense. Churchill spoke not of negotiation or survival but of defiance. He spoke as though Britain still possessed the strength to fight indefinitely. His voice rose and fell with a strange confidence, promising resistance on beaches, in fields, in streets and hills. The tone was not desperate. It was resolute, almost calm. Karl finished the transcript and carried it down the corridor to his superior, Major Heinrich Adler, who had served as an artillery officer during the last war and now oversaw intelligence summaries flowing toward Berlin's highest offices. Adler read the pages silently, his brow tightening with each paragraph. "Is the translation accurate?" he asked. Karl nodded. "Word for word." "Her Major." Adler set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, Berlin hummed with quiet confidence. Cafes were open again. Newspapers printed maps showing the Reich stretching across Europe. The war, people believed, was ending before it had truly begun. "Strange," Adler murmured. Karl waited, unsure whether the remark required a response. "France fought harder than this," Adler continued. "They had armies, fortifications, and allies. And yet their government collapsed once the military situation became clear." He tapped the paper with a finger. "But the British, they speak as though defeat is impossible." Karl had been thinking the same thing but had not dared say it aloud. In the days that followed, more reports arrived. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the English coastline. Naval officers studied tides and harbors. Staff planners spoke cautiously of a possible invasion, an operation that would later receive the code name Operation Sea Lion. Yet even as the plans circulated, the assumption remained that they would never need to be executed. Britain, everyone believed, would come to its senses. Weeks passed. No diplomatic envoy arrived. No request for negotiations reached Berlin. Instead, British broadcasts continued with the same stubborn tone. Factories in England were said to be increasing production. Fighter aircraft still appeared over the channel when German reconnaissance planes crossed too close to the coast. One evening Karl stood on the balcony outside the intelligence office, watching the sun sink behind Berlin's rooftops. The city seemed peaceful, almost detached from the war that had reshaped an entire continent. Somewhere far to the west lay the narrow strip of water that separated Germany from its last enemy. Adler joined him on the balcony and lit a cigarette. "They will ask for peace soon," the major said quietly, as though repeating something he had already told himself many times. Karl looked west, imagining the island beyond the horizon. "Yes, Herr Major," he replied, but in truth he was no longer certain. Something in Churchill's voice during that broadcast had sounded different from the speeches of defeated leaders Karl had translated before. It was not the tone of a man bargaining for survival. It was the tone of someone preparing for a fight that logic insisted he could not win. And that was the first moment the war began to feel strange. The maps in the operations room changed every morning, but always in Germany's favor. Oberleutnant Karl Weiss stood before them with a pencil tucked behind his ear, studying the numbers that flowed in from every command headquarters across the Reich. The war had become arithmetic now. Columns of figures filled the intelligence reports. Divisions available for deployment, tanks ready for action, aircraft counted on runways stretching from northern France to the Low Countries. When Karl compared them with the estimates of British strength, the result was brutally simple. Germany possessed more of everything that mattered. More soldiers, more armor, more planes. War, the staff officers liked to say, was decided by mathematics long before the first shot was fired. Across the narrow waters of the English Channel stood the remnants of the British Army that had escaped the beaches during the Dunkirk evacuation. The evacuation had saved the men, but it had left their weapons behind in the sand of northern France. German reports described miles of abandoned equipment, burned trucks, shattered artillery pieces, broken tanks half buried by tides. The soldiers who had crossed the channel were alive, but they were stripped of the machines that turned men into an army. Major Heinrich Adler gathered his staff around the long oak table each afternoon to review the situation. Karl watched the officers lean over the maps while cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling. Pins marked the German divisions stationed along the Channel coast. Red markers stretched from Calais down to Cherbourg, each one representing thousands of soldiers waiting only for orders. In total, there were more than 100 divisions within striking distance of Britain. "Look at the geography," Adler said one day, tapping the map with a ruler. "An island 20 miles from our coast. An army that has lost most of its equipment. No allies anywhere on the continent." He turned toward Karl. "Tell me, Weiss, what does the arithmetic say?" Karl hesitated before answering, though the conclusion had already formed in his mind many times. "The arithmetic says Britain cannot win." Adler nodded slowly. "Exactly." The assumption flowed through every level of command. Britain had no continental foothold from which to launch a counterattack. France had surrendered. The Low Countries were occupied. Norway was secured. The German army controlled every port and airfield from which the island could be threatened. Even the most cautious planners believed the outcome was inevitable. Somewhere in London, they reasoned British leaders were studying the same numbers. Rational governments made rational decisions. Once defeat became obvious, negotiations followed. That was how modern war worked. So the German Foreign Office began preparing for peace that had not yet been requested. Draft proposals circulated quietly between ministries. Some officials argued Britain should retain its empire if it agreed to withdraw from the war. Others suggested a limited occupation of strategic ports. The details varied, but the underlying assumption remained constant. Sooner or later, Britain would ask for terms. Carl spent long evenings translating intercepted messages from British radio broadcasts, searching for signs that the request might already be coming. But each transcript sounded the same: defiant, stubborn, strangely confident. It was as if the British government refused to acknowledge the obvious reality facing it. The weeks passed. The diplomatic channels remained silent, and the telephone that everyone expected to ring in Berlin never did. One gray morning, a courier rushed into the intelligence office carrying a fresh packet of intercepted broadcasts. Carl slit the envelope open and unfolded the typed pages inside. The speech had been delivered the night before on the BBC. The speaker's voice, recorded and replayed through German monitoring equipment, carried a tone that made Carl feel uneasy before he even finished translating the words. The speaker was Winston Churchill. Carl read the opening lines twice, certain he had misunderstood the English phrasing. The words sounded less like a political speech and more like a declaration of something deeper, something almost stubbornly irrational. "We shall fight on the beaches," Churchill said. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets." Carl lowered the paper and stared across the office. Clerks continued typing reports while telephones rang quietly in the background. But the room suddenly felt smaller, as if the speech had altered the atmosphere itself. He carried the translation to Major Adler, who read it with growing disbelief. "This cannot be serious," the major said at last. Carl said nothing. The words on the page were clear enough. Churchill was not speaking about negotiation. He was promising resistance everywhere, in cities, in the countryside, on beaches where an invasion might come. Adler leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Wars end when the outcome is clear," he said quietly. "That is the rule every nation follows." Carl understood the logic behind the statement. France had surrendered once its armies collapsed. Smaller countries had negotiated even sooner. Nations did not fight battles they had already lost. Yet Churchill's speech ignored that rule entirely. The British Prime Minister was promising a war without end. In the intelligence summaries forwarded to Berlin, the speech was described as political theater meant to rally a shaken population. The analysts concluded that Britain's leaders were simply buying time, hoping that circumstances might change before the inevitable negotiations began. Major Adler agreed with the assessment. "No government can maintain such a position forever," he told Carl later that day. "Eventually reality forces decisions." Carl nodded, though the certainty he had once felt about the war was beginning to fade. The numbers still favored Germany overwhelmingly, but the British response to those numbers no longer made sense. Weeks later, the Luftwaffe began preparing the campaign that was supposed to bring the matter to a final conclusion. Airfields across northern France filled with bombers and fighters. Mechanics worked through the night while pilots studied maps of southern England. The plan was simple: destroy Britain's air force, clear the skies above the Channel, and open the path for an invasion that would end the war once and for all. When the first raids began, the scale of the attack stunned even the German crews involved. The campaign would later be known as the Battle of Britain. Hundreds of aircraft crossed the Channel in carefully organized formations, their engines droning across the summer sky as they descended toward English airfields and radar stations. German commanders expected the British fighters to vanish quickly under such pressure. Intelligence reports suggested the Royal Air Force had already been weakened by the fighting in France. A few weeks of sustained bombing, they believed, would finish the job. But something strange happened almost immediately. Every day the German bombers returned to England, and every day British fighters rose to meet them. Pilots reported encounters with Spitfires and Hurricanes that seemed to appear out of nowhere, intercepting the raids before they reached their targets. Some German crews began to notice something even more unsettling. The number of British aircraft did not seem to be shrinking. If anything, it appeared to be growing. Carl read the after-action reports late at night in the intelligence office. Bomber crews described swarms of fighters attacking their formations over Kent and Sussex. Pilots spoke of radar-guided interceptions that placed British aircraft precisely where the bombers were headed. Losses mounted slowly but steadily. The campaign that was supposed to shatter the RAF within weeks stretched into months. And with every passing day, the invasion plan known as Operation Sea Lion drifted further from reality. Smoke hung over London like a permanent twilight. Even hours after the bombers disappeared into the night, the city glowed with scattered fires that reflected off the low clouds. For the German planners watching from across the channel, the conclusion seemed obvious. No modern city could survive this kind of punishment. Night after night, waves of bombers crossed the water, unloading explosives across docks, rail yards, factories, and neighborhoods. The campaign would later be known as the Blitz, but to the men planning it, it was simply the next logical step. If bombs could not eliminate the Royal Air Force in the skies during the Battle of Britain, then perhaps they could eliminate the will of the people beneath it. In Berlin, intelligence officer Karl Weiss studied the photographs arriving after each raid. Entire blocks of London were blackened ruins. Warehouses near the Thames burned for days. Train stations collapsed into twisted metal. By every model of modern warfare, the results should have been decisive. Civilians exposed to this scale of destruction were expected to demand peace. Governments under that pressure usually gave it to them. But the reports from Britain began to tell a different story. Factories did not close. They worked longer hours. Aircraft production, instead of slowing down, accelerated. British fighters appeared in greater numbers over southern England. Even more confusing were the intercepted radio broadcasts. Karl translated them every morning, listening to voices that sounded tired, frightened, but strangely unbroken. The speeches of Winston Churchill did not promise victory tomorrow. They promised endurance. And endurance, it turned out, was enough. Britain never regained clear military superiority in 1940. German armies still controlled the continent. The invasion plan known as Operation Sea Lion remained theoretically possible. But the war had already changed in a quieter way. Britain had survived the moment when it was supposed to collapse. That survival forced Germany into a longer war than it ever intended to fight. Plans shifted eastward toward the vast territories of the Soviet Union, launching the massive campaign known as Operation Barbarossa. And when Japan struck the American fleet during the attack on Pearl Harbor, another giant entered the conflict. What began as a lightning conquest of Europe slowly transformed into a global war that Germany could not control. Years later, historians would debate the battles, the strategies, the industrial power of nations. But Karl often thought about something simpler. He remembered the summer reports of 1940, when every calculation predicted Britain's defeat. The numbers had been correct. The logic had been flawless. The only variable the models failed to measure was a decision made by a country standing alone on an island under fire. A decision that ignored probability. A decision that refused negotiation. Because sometimes the turning point of a war is not a weapon, an army, or a strategy. Sometimes it is simply a nation choosing not to quit.